that you have a lot of scientists who have done a lot of research, have a lot of data to support this big idea. Based on the current technology, we can't change that big idea. So we would think of it more like a fact. And I say fact because something can change in the future based on the technology we have to maybe alter this big idea or this fact. When we're talking about the history of life, here's kind of an interesting thing, and this is where people who may have the idea of there's a greater being, whatever you want to call it, that has created life. Science says we don't know either. We don't know how life started. And so this is what we would call the hypothesis part of evolution. Here are some ideas of how life may have started. So if you have had influence in your life where you've always thought this greater being created life, you can still have that in science. And that's one thing where a lot of people kind of fight evolution, is they get really kind of upset because it messes with their belief system. And science is saying, no, go ahead. Believe that, because we don't know either. And that's a big misconception that I wish was more widely known. So we're going to take a look at a lot of this hypothetical things. There is data, if we go down into rocks and we look at fossils, we look at core samples of different gases and different minerals, we have ideas of what life kind of looked like. But all of this data that we have, it doesn't say how life started either. So just to clarify that. So let's talk a little bit about prebiotic evolution. Remember, anything that has bio means living, pre means before. So we're talking about what happened before life was here. What were the conditions like? So early Earth had a lot of different conditions than we do have today, although they're becoming way more similar as the days go on. There were the influence of inorganic molecules. So ammonia, hydrogen, water is an inorganic molecule. Methane, however, is a very small organic molecule. So these are the main elements that we found in our atmosphere. Ammonia is typically very toxic to living things, and so this was a condition of early Earth that didn't favor living things. Do you see oxygen, free oxygen here? There's no free oxygen up here. So that was if present, very, very, very small quantities of it. We do have oxygen in other inorganic molecules like water, for example, but we don't have free oxygen here. And so we'll talk about why that makes a really big difference in the evolution of life. So let's talk about how do we think the Earth formed? We think the Earth formed about 3.9 to 4 billion years ago, maybe even 4.2 billion years ago. It is thought that a bunch of meteorites smashed together and made this big rock that was hot in the middle, cooler on the outside, and it started rotating around the sun. Primitive Earth is, again, very different in some ways, very similar, that it was very energetic. Lots of meteor strikes, lots of lightning, lava flowing from the core of the Earth. So here we have a lot of energy. With energy as a catalyst, we have the ability of inorganic molecules to undergo reactions. And so this is kind of a key thing, is that it being so energetic, you have the ability of these energy sources to cause things to react faster. The Earth was covered in water. So we have a liquid surface completely with some land masses coming out, maybe volcanoes. And as the volcanoes spewed, that hot core of the Earth lays down more land over time. So let's talk about some of the possible first steps of how those energetic sources could take those inorganic molecules and help them to form organic molecules. Usually they started out as very small molecules, like for example, methane, which is CH4, is a very small organic molecule. And then from there we might have other things that interact. Carbons, hydrogens, nitrogens, oxygens, if we have a bunch of these inorganic molecules. And so one of the things I want to go back and define is an organic molecule has carbon with hydrogen covalently bonded to it. That's just background information. So this is an organic molecule, because you have carbon that's bonded to hydrogen. The possibilities of carbon bonding to carbon, bonding to ammonia, losing a hydrogen to become what we know as an amino group on an amino acid, and some other variable group that can be added onto here, is that with those energetic sources, it could cause this to develop. And how do we know that? Is we have an experiment specifically that takes a look at adding inorganic molecules together in a contained environment. We add energy and water, all the things that were present in early Earth. Again, oxygen free, I should really say, because oxygen would have been in water. When you added all those together, added your energy source in this enclosed environment, what appeared after a few days is these inorganic molecules reacted together to form organic molecules. Small organic molecules. They reacted in a way that formed things like amino acids that end up in chains becoming proteins. They ended up becoming things like DNA and RNA, carbohydrates, lipids, all of the biomolecules that when added together become a living thing. So this is the idea of that randomness again, that evolution emphasizes with mutation, is that mutations constantly have been random over billions of years to get us to all of the species that we have today. That could, all of these things randomly have happened 4 billion years ago to set up life. Maybe, right? So again, we get all of these kind of important biomolecules. In addition, important things are formed like ATP, which is the energy source that fuels most of our cells. So again, we have a lot of characteristics that are happening in this enclosed environment that Miller-Urey have created to show, this could be like how life started. Other things that came were not on the original meteorites that formed the Earth, but constantly meteorite strikes are bringing more atoms and contributing to the process. So this is what Miller-Urey's setup looked like. As again, enclosed environment. In one chamber, they added small inorganic molecules. They had a boiling chamber. They added a couple different energetic sources like heat, like electricity. They had a cold flow condenser that would force the rotation through this enclosed environment. And depending on what small organic molecules they added here, depended on what kind of larger molecules formed. But they did a lot of different simulations with what they added and got all of those small organic molecules that we know as the biomolecules today. So they believe slowly over time that in these watery environments, as land came up, it formed shallow pools. And in these shallow pools, you had a bunch of these inorganic molecules that got stuck together. You have electricity in that you have lightning that strikes, and they combine together to start to make the basis of small organic molecules, which combine to make small cells, and cells eventually combine to make simple organisms. Sorry. So what they believe was forming in these isolated little pools is called, they name it the primordial soup. So this kind of thick, soupy environment may have given rise to simple organisms. And we know one of the many principles of evolution is that simple leads to, over time, complex. So what do they think the first cells looked like? Many hypotheses about what happened with these small organic molecules and what were these first cells. Some of the most accepted forms of hypotheses are that it was bacteria or archaea, very simple single-celled organisms that we still have on Earth today because as single cells, they have remained successful on the Earth environment. So even how life started, right? A lot of debate, a lot of confusion, rightly so, because no one was there to take data. We don't have that information. We use the information that we can get out of the cores of the Earth, out of the atmosphere, and other ideas like miliary array. Is life and the creation of it simple enough to happen by chance? Possibly. There's still, to this day, a lot of scientists make simulations and say, I think it happened like this because I made this simulation, I made that simulation, but a lot of it stems from what miliary array did. So let's think about life on Earth in terms of a 24-hour clock. Humans are super duper new to the Earth in the grand scheme of things. So when you looked at all of the ancestors of modern humans, the Homo sapiens, you saw changes that happened in the last millions of years. So we haven't been around, humans, very long. We're pretty new to the Earth. We evolved in the ways that we evolved over time, eventually giving rise to our big brains, really changed the Earth and evolution quickly. We're one of the more influential organisms that have ever been on the Earth. However, if we go back like 4 billion years and you get those first prokaryotes, which are single-celled, simple organisms, you see first prokaryotes come around somewhat close after the Earth was formed, and then nothing happens for a while. So half of the life of the Earth, we have these simple organisms that are single-celled, and then we have a huge influence here about halfway through is free oxygen. So oxygen as O2, up until this point, didn't exist, and when it did start to exist, it was super toxic because organisms weren't equipped to deal with free oxygen. We use oxygen mainly as organisms to take energy and make it more useful to our cells. It's called cellular respiration. And so organisms that didn't have mutations to deal with cellular respiration using oxygen, they were using cellular respiration without oxygen up until this point. Many died off. And those that survived this big change in environment allowed for evolution to rock and roll. That we get quick evolution, and not super quick, but we have a lot of changes from no free oxygen having free oxygen, then you see a lot of organisms form. So big influence here. If we go back a few million years after free oxygen, we get the first eukaryotes. Karyote means nucleus, eu means with, pro means without. So prokaryotes are simple single-celled organisms that don't have a nucleus. And eventually you get cells with a nucleus. And the big change here is the protection of the DNA into its own organelle, the nucleus. So it makes the DNA less susceptible to getting degraded within the cell. So it protects it. So that's a big deal. And then you see a few million years go by, you get the first multicellular organisms. So again, we're still talking about unicellular, all the way up until just like a quarter, well, 3/4 of the life of the Earth. And then we really start to see evolution after we get multicellular organisms with a nucleus. We're still talking about organisms are in water here. Organisms are in water, including the first animals were water animals. The first producers were water producers because the animals had to eat something. When plants invaded land, animals who had adaptations that helped them to survive on land follow, have a lot of food to eat, and then eventually, in just a short period of evolutionary time, we get flowers and we get the rest of the animals, we get the rest of the prokaryotes, other prokaryotes, we get protists, we get fungi, we get all kinds of diversity of life on land in a very short period of time, including humans, which are very, very late in evolutionary time. So let's answer this question. The scenario of prebiotic evolution leading to the origin of life is plausible or possible. Why? So here's one of these questions where it's always like, if it says all of the above, it's likely all of the above. Is this all of the above? Good. So nope. Just know that when you're going into your testing in life, don't trust this as that's the answer. Make sure you read everything individually. Do mutations occur because of environmental pressure? No, they do not occur because of environmental pressure. Environmental pressure exists on its own, and if an organism just happens to have a mutation to live and survive in that environmental pressure, the organism